going to continue with Living the Law of One. This is part 13 and chapter 2. Peace Pilgrim carried no money and would not accept donations. She ate only when someone offered her food. She was, in a word, fearless. And we should not find this surprising. After all, to her, people were lights. She saw them at the soul level. They were all one with her. And in all her miles of solitary walking, she was never once treated with roughness or incivility. People who knew her said that there was something about her that protected her. Peace Pilgrim said she just looked everyone in the eye and loved them. She was once asked why her marriage was special, and she replied that there was nothing new or special in her marriage. Sorry, that's message. She was once asked why her message was special, and she replied that there was nothing new or special in her message of peace except her practice of it. She walked her talk literally for 28 years. She passed from this life in 1981. Martin Luther King. This entity, Martin, dealt in a great degree with rather negative orange ray and yellow ray vibratory patterns. However, this entity was able to keep open the green ray energy center due to the severity of its testing. If anything, this entity may be seen to have polarized more towards the positive due to its fidelity to service to others in the face of great catalyst. You see, all this is taken into advantage. How much you're up against is taken into account. So if you're up against severe catalyst, and through that severe catalyst, you're still serving others and still sending out love and light, you're going to be more polarized. That's going to polarize you even more. Okay, so to continue. Martin Luther King was born Michael, but changed his name to Martin as a young man. He grew up the son of a pastor in Atlanta, Georgia. His father and his grandfather had both been pastors before him. In 1953, at the age of 24, he became a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks went to his church, and in 1955, when she declined to give up her seat in the rear of the bus, by the way, she was sitting in the proper area for people of colour. The gentleman asking her to leave her seat simply wanted to give her trouble. King led the Montgomery bus boycott in action which lasted over a year, at the end which the Supreme Court issued a ruling outlawing racial segregation on all public transport. So there you go. The difference you can make is incredible. We don't realise. During this campaign, King's house was bombed and he was arrested as well as being verbally abused. However, this only strengthened the resolve of himself and that of his growing family. He and his wife, Coretta, had 4 children. In 1957, he reached out to the community and founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a clearinghouse group organising civil rights protests, marches, and other actions. King went wherever he felt he was directed in order to lead protests against unfair and unjust practices, whether the issue was of jobs, schooling, or peace. At one point, he and his family moved to the slums of Chicago for a year because they felt that, as middle-class people, they had not experienced either the depths of prejudice or the impact of true poverty. Fascinating. He and his family were committed to doing whatever it took to sever the hopes and needs of all the people of colour here in the United States. His children continued his work in the present day. King's credo was Christian, but his mentor was Mahatma Gandhi in Hindu. Nevertheless, their aims and attitudes were very similar. Gandhi had led the Indian nation as a successful campaign to remove the British Raj from India. It took him all his life, and he was gunned down by an assassin, as was King. Gandhi's activities were focused on a passive resistance. King loved Gandhi's creativity with ways of protesting peacefully and his dedication to non-violence. King insisted that his marches and protests be non-violent, and if he found ahead of time that violence was planned, he called off the marches to save the people. He worked in all cases to make agreements with governmental forces wherever he led actions. Indeed, he took criticism from the impatient members of the SCLC constantly because of his earnest attempts to retain total non-violence. Between 1957 and 1968, King travelled over 6 million miles and spoke to over 2,500 audiences. People who stand up and speak out in any culture run the risk of making enemies. King was no exception. The FBI openly tapped his telephone. King was assaulted 5 times, put in jail numerous times, and more disturbed and distrusted by Southern segregationists. Despite winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his work, despite an avalanche of public recognition in the form of Harmony degrees and awards of service, he was shot to death by an assassin in Memphis in 1968. He was in that city to help the striking sanitization workers receive a fair wage. As a direct outgrowth of his life's work, a legislation package covering civil rights in education and jobs was passed in 1964. Much still needs to be done to bring people of colour into a true equality in America, but the worst of abuse due to racial prejudice has been reined in by legislation. We still have not seen King's promised land of justice, fairness and equality. We can, however, see significant progress thanks to him and to those whom he inspired. We're still seeing kind of racial issues come up now, aren't we, with that poor guy who got shot down in America, got strangled. Yeah, the guy, I'm trying to think of his name, but it was a coloured guy who got strangled in America by a lot of police. You watch that video and it makes you feel sick to your stomach, to the pit of your stomach, and the core of your being, is just disturbed, and if it's not, then you're not on the path of service to others. You're not on the positive polarity. If that scene didn't make you feel sick to the pit of your stomach, then you're simply not on the path of positive service to others. And you're still either undecided or you're on the negative path, but you just don't know it. To continue, in his famous speech in the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, he said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. I marched when I was a college student in 1964 for equal job rights here in Kentucky. I was part of that heady time when students and citizens of all ages banded together to call for justice. That cause is still just, and King's words still urge us all onward to do the right thing." Examples of negative polarity. Genghis Khan, this is who I mentioned earlier on. So Genghis Khan and Gregory Rasputin are 2 of the primary humans in the last however many hundreds of years, or thousands of years even, to graduate into the negative density of service to self. Bear in mind, it's extremely hard. You need to spend 95% of your life being narcissistic and negative in every single way. And you have to have less than 5% service to others. So we shall see. Let me just see who's... I think this is Quo. It's either Quo or Ra. Yeah, I think this could be Quo. Anyway, let's just read it out. Meritocracy. Sorry, what is that word? Meritocracy is used to describe a competitive society that accepts large inequalities of income, wealth, and status amongst the population as a function of perceived talent, merit, competence, motivation, and effort. Meritocracies reject the ideology of equality whilst embracing the doctrine of equal opportunity. Okay, yeah, that doesn't sound like Quo or Ra. Let's just read on. Genghis Khan was called Temujin. hope I've pronounced that right, at his birth in Mongolia around 1162. He grew up poor and on the road, a nomad like all of his tribe. The Mongolian nations occupied land sandwiched between what we think of as southern parts of Russia and the lands of south of Russia, such as Nepal and India. The Mongol nations had warred with each other ceaselessly for centuries. As a young man, Genghis Khan united them ruthlessly and mercilessly, eliminating his challenges among the tribes. The reason why he did this is because his father was brutally murdered. His father was a leader of his tribe, so he inherited the title as the head of his tribe, and Genghis Khan swore ruthless revenge on all the enemies, and once he'd wiped out his enemies, he just didn't stop. He continued for the rest of his life and took over much of the world, as I'm sure Carla's going to tell us. To continue, he then took his united tribes into a wider campaign of conquests. After 50 years of continuous battle, had created the Mongolian Empire, the largest contagious empire ever held by one ruler in the known history of the earth. Wow. It encompassed territory from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, to the middle of Europe. The period of his empire is from 1206 to 1405. He himself did not expand the empire to its largest. This was done by his descendants. He also enabled the Mongol nations to defend themselves successfully against the Chinese dynasties of those times. The Mongol Empire was the most powerful superpower of the Middle Ages. There you go. Trade along the Silk Road, with safe travel along its length, made possible on account of the intimidation of the vast empire by the Mongols, created a connection between the Orient and the Western world. Cultural exchanges created a growing richness of civilizations for both East and West, as well as providing a handy route for the spread of the plague from Europe eastward into the Orient of the 15th century. So, wow, perhaps 30 million people were killed. Where? I'm just going to read that. Yeah, that is right. So, yeah, perhaps 30 million people, were killed by Genghis Khan's forces. God, during the 50 years of his continuous campaign. During that time, the population of China was cut in half. He found mass extermination of cities to be his favourite tactic for taking over nations, since few cities enjoyed the prospect of surrender. Most cities had challenged were utterly destroyed. Those who did surrender were left alive, but made into vassals and slaves. The Mongols pride themselves on their iron custodians and constitutions, and fought in winter by preference because most other armies found winter's extremities weather difficult. All males were induced and inducted into the army, and honour was gained only by warfare. The habits of competition and warfare among the Mongols made Genghis Khan's method of meritocracy work. There was a constant recognition of power depending on success in combat. Discipline was extremely tight, so tight that in general even poor and defenceless people were safe on the roads within the empire. Lapses on discipline were punished by death, even for small infractions. This was a reign of pure terror. Earth has not produced many examples of pure evil, Genghis Khan included, although the rare group said that he did graduate into service to self, so his polarity must have been 5% service to others or less. That means 95% service to self. He attempted to do positive things. He promoted trade, and his civil governance was productive of peace, although a cowed and intimidated peace. It has been said that this policy was merely useful in keeping his subjects under complete control. He himself believed he was serving the command and the common good. However, he accepted as given that force and intimidation ruled as fear was the key weapon. His idea of diplomacy was to let the city know that he had a choice. Either they could surrender or they could be destroyed. He was an excellent terrorist, and he promoted men who were able to follow his example. In the battles for northern China especially, he often slaughtered vast innocent populations even though they were not offering any resistance. This wholesale slaughter was of such proportions that the language of some areas changed from Iranian to Turkish. In some cases in China, so much destruction occurred that no records remain.